Start up the recording. Good. Okay, do people have my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Yep.
Okie dokie. Well, here we are. The evolution of the Roman Constitution, 650 to 287 BC. Let me start with the standard disclaimer. I'm not a professor, I'm not a historian, I have no advanced degree. What I am is a student of history, and this is really an opportunity for me to share what I've been learning, share my own reading, and to engage in a conversation with all of you folks who I know share my interest and love for history. I encourage everybody to please jump in at any time with questions or comments or disagreements. Those are good too. If anybody prefers to put their comment or question in the chat, let me ask Zach to please keep an eye on that, and because I won't be able to monitor that while I'm talking, and just jump in, Zach, if anybody does put it in the chat.
Sure.
Okay, and with that, with no further ado, let's go. We're looking here, as I'm sure many of you know, this is the forum on the Capitoline Mount in Rome, as it looks today. The major source that I'm following in doing this presentation, as with my previous presentations, is T.J. Cornell, The Beginnings of Rome. I hear before this, people were talking about Mary Beard. Mary Beard wrote a review of this book in which she said that she expects that it will be the standard text going forward on early Rome. And it seems like that's actually happening. I was looking online, and I been finding Cornell's theories and reconstructions really growing all over the internet. He's now I looked up something in the Oxford Classical Dictionary, and he was the author of the entry, along with another very renowned scholar, Arnaldo Momiglia. And I'm finding that in Wikipedia pages, they will now typically give the kind of traditional interpretation, and then there'll be two more paragraphs saying, but Tim Cornell argues the following, and then they'll lay out Cornell's argument. So it looks like this is really having this book and his interpretations of the history are really having a major impact on the academic world. So, Constitution of the Roman Republic. Our major source for the Roman Republic is Polybius. And I'm sure that if any of you look on YouTube, you will see really a large number of videos on the Roman Constitution, all based on primarily on the writings of Polybius. And Polybius, of course, was one of the great historians of antiquity. Some modern historians would consider him the greatest historian in antiquity. He was a Greek who lived and worked at Rome, where he was a hostage after Rome's conflict with the Achaean League in Greece, and he was associated with the family of Aemilius Paulus and Scipio Aemilianus. They were extremely close. He was a mentor of Scipio Aemilianus, so he had the opportunity to observe Roman government and Roman politics at much closer hand. I mean, he really had amazing access. And he described, as you see here, the Roman Constitution with all its offices and their elaborate flowcharts. But if we look at a timeline, and here's basically a timeline of the Republic, from the establishment of the Republic to effectively the end of the Republic, which was when Julius Caesar assumed the dictatorship for life. And within this, we see that Polybius was active for this period of time from about the middle of the second century until his death, which was, I think, around 114 BC. I think his last work was in 134 BC. And the scope of his work started in 390. That's the first, he starts with the sack of Rome by the Gauls in 390 BC. But, and let me add that in this period, he's living during the period of the unquestioned dominance of the Senate, which had been going on for, since the Second Punic War. And the point that Cornell makes is that for Polybius and for many of the historians of Rome, in Rome, that they really could not conceive of a time when the Senate was not the dominant institution in Rome, when it was a completely different thing. And they saw events through their current lens, just as people do now, and were really unable to have an unbiased view or an uninfluenced view of the earlier history. And add to that, they did not have access to archaeology, and they did not have a tradition of 150 years of scientifically oriented historical research, which all built on the stuff that came before. So I'm going to be focusing on something else. I'm going to be doing an attempt to do a different type of presentation on the Roman Constitution. What I'm going to try to do is, first of all, talk about the Roman Constitution as it developed. When the different institutions of Rome, what was their formation, under what circumstances did they form, and I'm also going to try to deal with the Constitution in a larger sense. So rather than just limiting myself to, well, these were the offices and this is what they voted for and these were the assemblies, I'm going to try to talk about the Roman Constitution in the sense of what was the makeup of the Roman state and the Roman society. So in addition to talking about politics, I'm going to try to talk about the social organization within Rome that was the context in which all of this history occurred. So historians and archaeologists now define something that they call the urban period of Roman history, starting at about 650. And this is about the time when archaeologists begin to discover what they call princely graves. So graves, human remains, and more than that, the materials that are deposited in graves are really our primary source of information about early Rome. And what we see starting at about 650 is an explosion of riches in Rome, and it tells you two things. First, it shows you the enormous influence of the Greeks. So the piece that we're looking at is very much like a Greek vase, except it's in gold with the different registers. Those are the three bands and the repetitive images. It's very much like a geometric Greek vase of the Archaic period, and this is the Archaic period. And what archaeologists conclude when they see these sorts of grave goods and riches in the grave is that this indicates the development of an aristocracy. It shows that. Yeah.
Sorry, question. Is it possible? I mean, do they know for sure that it was an Etruscan or was Roman? I mean, how do they say that?
Archaeology is in outside of Etruria. It's in Rome and in Latium, and it is Cornell's one of his major arguments is that it is not true that that Rome was ruled by the Etruscans or that the Etruscans were the major influence in the formation of Roman society. Rather, he argues that the Etruscans and the Romans both had direct contact with the Greeks, and it was the Greeks that basically taught them hoplite warfare, and which is to say how to be effective in the what was the state of the art in military technology. And even more importantly, the Greeks brought writing, they brought literacy, and they brought their political technology, which was the city-state, the polis. And so that's what he's really known for that position.
Thank you.
So this is the Roman aristocracy is essentially the earliest part of the Roman constitution. These are the people who are known in the texts as the patricians. And the word patrician is the adjective form of the Latin word pater, which means father. Patrician status was the exclusive preserve of certain clans, the patricii Gons. The main attribute of the patricians was prestige, derived from the fact that they were descended from the most ancient aristocracy of the city. They possessed certain privileges, including the right to wear a certain type of shoe and the exclusive right to hold certain offices, and that's throughout the history of Rome. The way that they were organized were in clans, and in these clans there was a structure which was known as the patron-client relationship. And this is something that persisted throughout the Republic. And the basic idea is that in Rome, patron-client relations were a central feature of social intercourse in all periods, and they were crucial for the life of the community. Some ancient sources, as well as modern scholars, suggest that the entire citizen body was divided into two groups, patrons and clients, but Cornell believes this is much too rigid. We should instead envision interlocking networks of patronage in which clients may have had several patrons, and that well-to-do clients could also be patrons for their own dependents. The important points are that impoverished people were not useful as clients, and that the most desirable and favored clients were people who were well off, who had something to offer, who had some degree of influence and power in their own sphere. And the clientele of these patrons included everything from basically bodyguards, hired warriors, and these patrician clans were, in many ways, they were warlords. They're sometimes described as condottieri, and they essentially had private armies. And we have epigraphical inscriptions from this period, which were loyalty oaths sworn by the followers of one particular patrician clan, where they dedicated themselves to the god Mars, the god of war, in service of their patrician master. But not all of their clients, of course, were soldiers or bodyguards, but there were basically people of influence in really any area where they had something that could be useful to the patrician, and where they in turn could profit from the protection of the patrician, his intervention in legal matters on their behalf. So when you look at Roman history and you look at the actions of particularly of patricians and senators in general, you always have to imagine that behind them there is this large network of clients that they wield, that will follow them, that will vote for the candidates that they support, that will support their policies, that will provide a way for several different members of the patriciate to form alliances which essentially combine their clients. And another thing to keep in mind, especially in the later Republic, is that this was a source of jealousy and competition, so that the patricians would band together against one of their ranks who looked like he was going to supersede them and have something in which he was going to massively increase his clientele and would no longer be an equal. So their effort was always to keep anybody from dominating and have a society in which their little in club was not threatened in any way. The institution associated with this part of the history of Rome is the Senate. And the Senate in this period was very different from the Senate as we know it later. The Senate, first of all, had a rotating membership. It was not an official body. And what they basically did was they advised the kings. They were just a council. There was no obligation of the king to listen to them. And they had no direct constitutional responsibilities, no thing that they were directly responsible for. And secondly, and this is one of Cornell's arguments, the Senate was not exclusively patrician. There were the term that the Romans used was, they said, the patres and the conscripti, those who were enrolled. So the implication that Cornell takes from that is that the Senate was not a strictly patrician body, but it also included well-to-do, influential people who were not themselves patricians. Between these influential clans, there were relationships. So, in other words, we have the patron-client relationship between social superiors and their social inferiors. But there were also relationships between equals. And these words translate into common English words. So amakitia is friendship, and inimici are enemies. But we need to understand that these were formalized terms in Rome. They were what lawyers would call terms of art. And there were specific rituals that are associated with forming an amakitia or dissolving an amakitia. And this was the way by which the ruling class would form alliances among themselves for their mutual interest. They would combine their clients, and they would try to avoid having enemies. But once they did, they would have this condition of hostility towards their enemies. And this was basically the earliest social organization of Rome. The next milestone in the Roman constitution was what are called the Servian reforms, which were the reforms of King Servius Tullius. I had a short presentation on this that I've given a few weeks ago, and I'm not going to duplicate that, but I'm going to just go over the main constitutional implications of the Servian reforms. So, according to Livy, Servius Tullius was the 6th king of Rome. There's no doubt that the achievements attributed to him have firm historical basis. He enacted a series of reforms that amounted to a total reorganization of the citizen body. His tribal reform, before Servius Tullius, the Roman clans were organized into a set of tribes which were called curiae, and they were organized around these aristocratic clans, and you gain membership by being born into it. And Servius Tullius broke that up completely. It survived in a kind of a vestigial form, but it no longer had great significance in Rome. And the tribal reform changed the basis of Roman citizenship and redefined the links by which individual Romans were bound to the community. The so-called Romulan tribes, which were organized based on the aristocratic clans, were functionally replaced. From now on, membership of a tribe and consequently entitlement to Roman citizenship depended on residence and on registration at a census, which was organized locally through the tribes. So the census was really an earth-shaking for Rome innovation. At each census, the city-state was reconstituted. At the end of the census, a ceremony called the lustrum was performed, and whoever did this was said to found the lustrum, perhaps suggesting that the ceremony was symbolic refounding of the city. There's no coincidence that our sources present Servius Tullius, the creator of the census, as the new founder of Rome. Yeah.
Question: were the Greeks also use census, or did they have any other
Mediterranean cultures had a census, but none of them had a regular census. Roman census occurred every 5 years, and they reorganized the citizen body based on the wealth of the individuals in the census, and they did this every 5 years, and that was unique. So there were other censuses in the ancient world, but none of them were repetitive like this, and none of them were used as this organizational feature and constant reforming, constant refining, and reseparating of the citizens.
I mean, something like what the Egyptians used to do is kind of, maybe wasn't head count, but was something kind of similar, right?
Well, I really don't know about census of Egyptians during the Pharaonic period, so maybe there's someone else that can comment on that, but I really don't really have any information on that myself. So in Rome, though, the census was really the basis for forming something called the Centuriate Structure. And there were two aspects to it. There was a saying that says the Roman votes, plows, and fights. And the Centuriate Structure really embodied that. So this was an assembly that was used for voting and voting on legislation. And later in the Republic, the Centuriate Assembly would have the responsibility of electing the highest officers, the consuls. But it was also the organizational structure of the military. So this was a recruiting mechanism. This was how they raised soldiers for their army. The fundamental purpose of the census was to register all those citizens who were both physically fit and economically capable of equipping themselves to serve in the army, and which at that time was the hoplite phalanx. And so really, the essence of the census was to find out who had enough wealth that they could function as heavy infantry, which is to say a member of the phalanx, who was still a citizen but didn't have that degree of wealth, so therefore they could serve as light infantry, or what the Romans called velites, people who used missile weapons, slings, javelins, and so forth. And then they had a third class called the proletariat, the proletarii, which were basically people without enough wealth, no land holding, and they were Roman citizens, but they had no ability to serve in the army. They were totally disenfranchised. There's another group that's not included in this diagram, which is the highest grouping, the equites. Equites means horsemen, and these in this period of time, this mapped directly to the Roman cavalry. Later in the Republic, when the Centuriate Assembly evolved, it started getting much more finely titrated wealth classifications. And ultimately, at the end of the 5th century, the connection between the Centuriate Assembly and the army were completely severed. And the Centuriate Assembly continued as the most important assembly in Rome. And it was structured based on this division, and based on the way really that Servius Tullius had set it up. they were able to engineer it into a body where the rich could outvote the poor and the old could outvote the young. The next big step is the establishment of the Republic, which traditionally I think is 509 BC. Greg, is that right? But in any event,
yes, that's right. 509.
509. But in any event, whether or not it's 509 or 507 or 503, it seems clear that it was in the last decade of the 6th century. And the Romans replaced the monarchy with a collegiate magistracy in which two men shared the supreme power, the consuls. They were actually originally called praetors, but it's very confusing, so I'm going to call them consuls. They were elected by the Centuriate Assembly and they held office for a year. They held imperium, which is the power to command, specifically the power to command the armies, the power to order the death of anybody. But within the city of Rome, they did not have the power to order somebody's death without appeal. And the two consuls would take turns holding the fasces. If you see in the right corner of this picture, you see those things with little axe heads. Those were the fasces. They were the symbol of power, of imperium. And the axe heads were removed inside the city of Rome, indicating that the consuls could not pass a death sentence on somebody without appeal. And so they were limited. They were replacing the kings, but the Romans were very careful to try to limit their power. And so their limitation was first that there was two of them. And if they had a disagreement, that would result in no action taken, right? The negative would prevail in the case of a dispute between the two consuls. And they only had a 1-year term of office. And we must keep in mind that the real job of the consuls was not to sit around in these fancy ivory thrones in their togas. Their real job was to lead the army in battle. And they did that because Rome was almost constantly at war for its entire history. And that's what the consuls did. Now, this idea of a collegiate magistrate, of having more than one, is something that the Romans applied to everything. They wanted to avoid this idea of kingship, and there was only one exception to that, which was what they called the dictatorship, the exception to the rule. This was a constitutional position. This was not something that would happen like in the modern world through a coup d'etat or something like that. The idea was that in cases of extreme emergency, a dictator would be appointed by one of the consuls to be the supreme commander of the army and the head of state. The dictator would appoint an assistant who was called the master of horse. The consuls remained in office, but were subject to the dictator's authority, and there was no appeal at all against anything decided by the dictator. He had absolute power of life and death over anybody where he could enforce that. The office, however, was designed to be short, so it was designed to end either after the end of the emergency or after 6 months, whichever of them occurred first. Under no circumstances was the dictator supposed to continue in office for more than 6 months. So let me also mention that there are historical theories that the consulship didn't kind of just spring up out of nowhere, that there was really a kind of a transitional period of time in which the dictatorship was actually the normal way that Rome was ruled. One of the arguments for this is that some of the neighboring Latin cities at this same time had dictators as their chief magistrate. That's a hypothesis that's put together by modern historians. And in any event, Cornell's conclusion is that our sources are probably correct in stating that an oligarchic coup, a coup by the aristocracy in around 500 BC, created the Roman Republic. The next real major occurrence, and this was the tension between the well-to-do and the common people. It's now, or it's been traditionally common to classify Romans as either patricians or plebeians, basically saying that anyone who is not a patrician is a plebeian, but this is not the way things were in the early republic. The plebes, the plebs, started as an organized group consciously formed at a time of crisis. Tradition places this crisis in 494 BCE, when a large number of the poor, oppressed by debt and arbitrary treatment, withdrew from the city as a group and occupied a nearby hill called the Sacred Mount. Here they created their own organization, which was like an alternative state. They formed their own assembly, which was known as the Concilium Plebis, the Council of the Plebes, and they elected their own officials, the tribunes of the plebes. And this whole event is called the Secession of the Plebes. The plebeian movement was most likely consisted of a mass of poor people, small farmers, agricultural workers, and urban craftsmen who shared a common sense of distress and were united by a commitment to the cause. The more prosperous but non-patrician landowners were not likely to have sympathized with the plebeian movement. Many, if not most, of the well-to-do were clients of patrician patrons, and they were quite satisfied with the status quo.
So, Paul,
yeah.
Sorry, so the plebeian, they were citizens, or were
yes,
okay,
emphatically citizens, definitely citizens. But the idea of dividing and saying everybody that was not a patrician was a plebeian is an anachronism. It becomes true later, and I'm going to talk about that. But at this time, the plebeians were a minority of the non-patricians, and they were a self-conscious political group. Essentially, understand them as a revolutionary organization, because that's what they were. They formed a state within a state, very much like, and very analogous to the Soviets that were formed as an alternative government to the provisional government during 1917 after the February Revolution.
The lefties.
Yes, absolutely, and they're seen, and the modern communist movement has claimed roots going back to the plebeian movement in Rome.
Mm-hmm.
So the plebeian movement provided a refuge to those who were excluded from the benefits of patronage. Now, it seems clear to me that there must have been some of the well-to-do who also joined the plebes, and that's because of, I say that because of the great sophistication of the institutions that they developed on their own. This did not come from a mass of poor and almost certainly illiterate farmers and tradesmen. So their magistrates were called tribunes, and there were different numbers of them. Ultimately, there were 10. And the tribunes, their authority was based on what the Romans called a lex sacrata, which is a sacred law. In other words, they had religious authority. And this was a big deal in Rome. In fact, the patricians claimed religious authority, and the patricians had a monopoly on the high priesthood, and the religious observance and the cult was eminently political. So the plebeians kind of turned the tables on the well-to-do by claiming a religious sanction for their organization. What this meant is that the plebeians swore to obey the tribunes they had elected, and to defend them to the death. And they said that anyone who harmed the tribune became accursed. The formula was, let him be accursed, was pronounced on persons who, by their actions or words, harmed the gods. Such a person became forfeit to the god in question. And this is the point. Anyone who killed the offender was carrying out a sacred duty and did so without incurring any penalty or blood guilt. In this way, the tribunes of the plebes become sacrosanct, essentially inviolable. And let me say that later on, this sacrosanctity, this power, was claimed by the emperors. It was claimed by Augustus first, and it was one of his most important powers. It meant that any action against him was against the gods, and as I said, the person who committed that could be killed by anybody with impunity, with no blood guilt of any kind. And it basically meant that no one could mess around with the tribune. You just couldn't screw with them.
Paul, I have a question on the messenger. So the question is, did the plebeian organization have any taxing powers on their membership?
There's no information to that to say that.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, I haven't read. I mean, the first time I read about taxation is in the Roman state in about 405 BC. That's where a tax called the tributa was instituted, and that, by the way, is kind of the point at which the Centuriate Assembly split from having a military function, and the wealth classes were used to assess tax burden. But for this earlier period, I don't think we have any information about taxation. And it's quite likely that these people had no money to provide as taxes. I mean, these were the people who were banding together out of desperation.
Hey, Paul?
Yeah.
So I forgive me if you've already covered this, but the second bullet point you have is plebeian tribal assembly.
Yeah.
So plebeian is a socioeconomic definition.
No, it's not.
Why is
it is not.
I thought it was.
And I'm saying that plebeian in this point is a political definition. It's a political organization. So yes, it has a social composition of its members. Absolutely, as I said, the poor. But
I guess I'm more confused by the word tribal, because when I think tribe, I think ethnic.
No, so go back to what I said about Servius Tullius. So what Servius Tullius did is he made the tribes geographic. So the tribes were not family groups. The tribes basically had become under the Servian reforms had been now geographic entities. And that's why it was such a profound reorganization of the state, because it went across family lines, it went across clan lines. And so the new tribes were an attempt to break up the kind of family nature of the older tribes. So it was really a democratic measure.
Thank you.
And these tribes would then get, as Rome would basically absorb new territory, typically through conquest or annexation, they would add new tribes. And the maximum number of tribes reached were 35.
Paul, I just wanted to make a reference that the reforms of Cleisthenes in Athens was very similar in that respect, that it created new tribes. There used to be like kind of 3, and they made 10 out of them in Athens, and also by geographical within the Athens. So it's I wonder if they utilized that information by that time, because the reforms were made.
I mean, all we can say is that we know that they had constant influence from the Greeks, and we know that fine Athenian pottery shows up in both Etruscan and Roman graves. Right. So there was constant social interchange going back and forth with the Romans. I mean, between the Romans and the Greeks. The Romans learned to read from the Greeks. They learned about the existence of an alphabet from the Greeks. So it's certainly possible that they knew about this or heard about this in some way. And
also 10 tribes.
Pardon me?
Same. The Athenians also had 10 tribes.
The Athenians had 10 tribes, but the key thing was that the Athenian tribes were geographic, just like these
Yes,
Scythian.
it's very similar. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, very similar, and for similar reasons. It was to break up the power of the aristocratic clans.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it was
Same reason.
similar, you know, from the motivation and the implementation.
Hey, Paul, you just said that the Romans found out about the alphabet from the Greeks. I would have thought they would have gotten from the Etruscans. They had an alphabet.
Well, my point that I made earlier is that the Greeks and the Etruscans independently had their own context with the Greeks, and that Tim Cornell argues very strongly that it's a big mistake to see the Etruscans as the civilized group that taught the Romans how to be civilized and how to build buildings and how to have an alphabet. He said that the Romans got that directly from the Greeks themselves. They had an independent channel, and the point that he makes is that from the point of view of the archaeology, the material remains of the Etruscans and the Romans from this period are identical. If you didn't know where it was found, you would not be able to tell the difference between an Etruscan excavation and a Roman excavation. So, I will also add that the Phoenicians were there as well. There were Phoenician influence, but the Greeks were the overwhelming influence on the Romans, and it continued throughout the history of Rome in different waves. This was the first wave of major Greek influence.
I'm confused when you say that if you're digging, you're excavating a site and you can't tell the difference between a Roman and Etruscan one. That sounds like the Etruscans and the Romans had a very tight culture, and it was outside of Greek influence. From that, I'm not understanding.
Because what you're finding in these excavations is Greek influence. So you're finding Greek armor, you're finding Greek vases, you're finding luxury goods that have been taken, that have come in from the East.
Would the Greek influence, would that have come from Greeks in Italy, the colonies?
Yes,
or from?
Yes,
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay.
It came primarily from the earliest Greek settlement was in the Bay of Naples on the what's now the island of Ischia.
In the south, there were a lot of.
Yeah,
right?
in the southeast.
What I'm saying, the very first Greek settlement in the West was at Ischia, which they called Pithecusae. And then right opposite them on the mainland, maybe 10 years later, they formed the city of Cumae. And they were primarily interested in metals. And there was large iron available in Etruria. So the Roman and the Etruscans were directly influenced by the Greeks. And it's clear in all of their graves. And later on, you can actually see that the Roman and Etruscan graves themselves were modeled on graves that you find in Greece from 100 years earlier. So there's no doubt that the primary influence was the Greeks, and it was direct.
Paul, I have maybe a general question, maybe a couple of questions. First questions I have is, it's not from the chat, it's my own question, sorry. Dictator, such an interesting subject matter, especially I was just mentioning Second Punic War and how they dealt with Hannibal. Was there any clause to expand the 6 months period, or he has to drop out after the 6 months? There's no question.
Well, first of all, let me say that the Romans didn't have a written constitution. They didn't say that the president shall have a 4-year term of office or anything like that. So what we know is that the later historians who had access to documents that no longer exist said that the dictatorship was designed to be only 6 months. Now, in the later republic, this would be violated again and again, right? Where a dictator would hold power for more than 6 months. And ultimately, as we saw with the first guy to really step on this was Sulla, and then followed by Julius Caesar. But the sources, the tradition, is pretty clear that this was designed to be a maximum of 6 months. And Cornell's position on this, and I think a lot of scholars, is that you don't discount the tradition unless you have a good reason. You can't just say, well, they didn't know what they were talking about. You really have to have an argument that demonstrates why the tradition should be ignored or why you should have a different hypothesis. So here, that's where the source of the information is.
Yeah, just wanted to add, you remember Cincinnatus, who resigned his dictatorship in 2 weeks, even though he could have stayed for various reasons through the
Yes.
term.
And,
so that
that
was considered to be a paragon of civic duty.
And that's why George Washington was called the modern
Right.
Cincinnatus,
Yeah.
because he stepped down after 2 terms. He'd been offered the kingship, and he said, no, America should not have kings, and then stepped down after 2 terms in office. And so, well, he had 2 terms of 4 years, and Cincinnatus had 2 weeks, but and Cincinnatus is a legendary figure, but he accomplished what he needed to do, and he was an exemplar of what the dictatorship was supposed to be. It was an emergency where you no longer could afford to have a divided command among 2 consuls. You needed to have a single voice. You needed somebody to rally the army, and then get rid of it as soon as you possibly can, because they didn't want a tyranny. So,
Paul, question that in all your reading, have you, one thing that I kind of call my attention here is all the things that we've seen men. Were the women organized to provide, who provide the soldiers?
I'm going to talk about that, but
great, because I've never seen anything about, who. What do they do?
Is that the role of women in the society was sadly extremely dominated by men. Women,
I understand, but who provides the uniforms, for example, for the soldiers? I don't see the soldiers.
We don't know that the soldiers had a uniform. In fact, the women probably did basically make the cloth that everybody wore. There was home industry, and spinning and weaving was done at home. So, so except for the very rich, most people, their clothing was made of homespun. But the army supplied its own weapons and armor. That was the whole idea of having a citizen army, and that was the reason why they had wealth classes for determining how you served in the army, whether you were going to be heavy infantry or light infantry. So there's absolutely no reason to think that there was any sort of uniformity in their uniforms, or even in the weapons that they carried or the armor that they had. It was very ad hoc. You were being asked to furnish your own kit, and showed up, and what you had is what you had.
Okay.
And understand that the army at this period of time was strictly designed to campaign for a short period of time in the summer, when the farmers could leave their farms after the plowing and the sowing, and then they could have a campaign and still have time to get back to their farms for the harvest.
Uh-huh.
So that's why we say this was. So that's the nature. That's why I talk about the Centuriate Assembly and the soldiers in arms. This is a period of time where it was really a people's army, a citizens' army. You were not professional soldiers. You were farmers.
Okay.
The only sort of professional soldiers that you might think of were the clients, the hired guns, if you will, of the major patrician family leaders.
A quick question. So it sounds very much like the way wars have been fought since warring began. And I'm thinking about the American Revolution, where most of the soldiers were also farmers. And when it was time to harvest the crops, they took off and then returned.
Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely right. It's tremendously expensive to maintain a standing army. And you don't see professional armies, standing armies, until you see major empires that have a huge tax base and are able to afford to pay soldiers to do nothing except sit around and get drunk until there was time for them to go out and fight. So yes, that you're absolutely right about that. So back to the tribunes. The Lex Sacrata, the sacred law, gave the plebeian tribunes extensive powers which derive from their inviolability. They were able to enforce their will by coercion. They could impose fines, imprisonment, or even the death penalty against anyone who challenged their authority or who made a physical or verbal assault on their persons. Because of their sacrosicity, I guess that's the right way to pronounce it. It could be wrong. The tribunes were able to protect individual plebeians from ill treatment by the rich and powerful. They could intervene and say, you can't touch this guy, and I'm a tribune and you can't touch me. And they could protect individual people from arbitrary punishment by the magistrates. At first, this was an extra legal procedure in which the tribune intervened personally and threatened opponents with dire consequences of the sacred law if they should try to use force against him. In effect, Cornell says you should think of this as lynch law, mob justice. So you can imagine that this did not make for domestic peace. You know, you had there was an incident described in the sources where let me go back here. So the plebeian assembly would pass, would have proposals put forward by the tribunes that were called plebiscites that they would vote on. But the plebiscites at this time were binding only on the plebes. So, which is why they would have to enforce it on the population as a whole through brute force. And they also, just as we're focusing on the Constitution, and we're also focusing on how sophisticated the plebeian organization was, they devised an office called the aediles, who were assistants, helpers of the tribunes. And among the aediles' responsibilities is to keep records of laws and enactments, and later they gained the right to have a record of the actions of the Senate, which previously had been secret, and they maintained an archive. So this is the first official archive in the history of Rome, and it's remarkable that these structures, these institutions, came from this lower class political revolutionary organization. And this created turmoil in the state, which was going on, as you see in my little bracket on the timeline, through the whole second half of the 5th century. So we can envision two processes taking place during the 5th century. First is the growth of the plebeian movement began to attract ambitious individuals from among the well-to-do, who found the prospect of wielding independent power as leaders of the plebes preferable to a subservient role as clients of the patricians. So if you were a rambunctious, well-to-do guy, but you were not a patrician, you had two choices. You could be a client and subservient to a patrician, or you could say, well, I'm going to join the plebes and have independent power. And this changed the face of the plebeian movement as plebeian leaders began to demand the right to actually hold the consulship in the republic. And the second parallel process was a reaction to this. It was the patricians' response, and this amounted to an attempt to ostracize the plebeian movement and to impose disabilities on its leaders. We'll see later that there was an item in the 12 tables that was designed to prohibit marriages between patricians and leading plebeians, which is to say that there must have been desire for that to happen. But through this period, there was a process and the modern historians call it the closing of the patriciate. And so in the first half of the 5th century, let's say 500 to about 450, in the list of consuls, and this is really one of the primary actual original sources, is something called the Fasti, which is the list of consuls going back to the beginning of the Republic. By analyzing the names of the consuls, modern historians are able to say whether they were patricians or non-patricians, let's say plebeians. And it's clear that in the first 50 years, the patricians did not have a lock on the consulship, but it got the lock actually developed. So starting at about 450 BC, there was a total monopoly on all of the higher offices of state exercised by the patricians, which basically forced the ambitious people who were not patricians into the plebeian camp. So this
How did they force them?
because they had in other words, their choice was to become the client of a big patrician, which is to say to accept a subordinate position, to say, okay, I'm going to be your flunky for the rest of my life. But if they wanted to be a player, right, if they wanted respect and they wanted to be independent, the only way they could get that was to join the plebeian organization, because that was the only way for a non-patrician to exert power.
Right, but how do the patricians won over the others, the clients or the plebeians?
They didn't have to. I mean, the first of all, the Centuriate Assembly was tilted towards the well-to-do.
Okay.
And the people who were well-to-do supported the status quo. They didn't.
Right, they support themselves, of course. I mean, that makes sense.
They supported the patricians.
Right.
So that was the basis of their ability to shut the non-patricians out of the higher offices. And
but they were a minority. I mean, the patricians were a minority next to the clients of the plebeians.
They were a minority, that's right, but they were able to exert disproportionate influence through their clients.
But by force, did they have the guns in quotation, so to speak?
They didn't really. It's not clear. I mean, the stories of what the sources, when they talk about force, it's usually the plebeians exerting their force against the patricians. But we know the patricians did have their own private armies. That's a test.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So maybe the wealthy, they have more money, so they have a bigger army, kind of.
Well, they had retainers. They had private bodyguards who were, in one case we know that one of the patrician families conducted a private war against an Etruscan city, and they had 300 essentially professional soldiers under their employ. They were wiped out to a man, right? This was the Fabius. Mm-hmm. Only one person survived from that whole group. So
to tell the story.
Yeah, to basically, and then to keep the line of the family going. So this was the nature of the society. And so you had this split, and this turmoil basically continued until it reached a head. And according to Polybius and Cato and Cicero, this came to a head in a set of dramatic events in 451. Basically, after years of turmoil, the patricians and the plebeians, and remember now when I say plebeians, I'm talking about the plebeian political organization, they agreed to suspend the constitution and appoint a body of 10 people called the decemvirs, right? Deca, like decade, is 10, and vir, means man. So 10 men to govern the state and to draft a set of laws. According to Cicero, the consuls and the tribunes of the plebes abdicated in favor of the decemvirs, who ruled with consular power but were not subject to appeal. So we see the drawing, an artist's rendition of the 10 men on the left. And it was their mandate to come up with a code of laws, codify the laws, which had been a plebeian demand. The poor in the ancient world are always demanding written laws because they're trying to get away from arbitrary power exercised by the rich. So even if the laws are oppressive, the fact that they're written down gives them a certain protection against the rich being able to do whatever they want. So this desire to have laws was a plebeian demand. So after a year in office, the decemvirs produced 10 tables of laws. And in the following year, there was a second college of decemvirs, excuse me, and they created 2 additional tables, bringing the total to 12. These are considered the basic laws of Rome. And Cicero tells us that in his day, schoolboys had to memorize these by heart. And that's one of the reasons that scholars believe that the 12 tables, even though it was said that they were destroyed during the Gallic sack of Rome, that there were many other copies of them, and that the 12 tables are an authentic document of the 5th century BC based on Cicero's evidence. So the 12 tables do not amount to a law code in the modern sense. There's no attempt to set out the whole of the law, and the areas that were covered were not comprehensive. So we're seeing a lot of things about family and domestic things and property, religious things, and I just want to specifically draw your attention to this idea of debt, slavery, and this institution that the Romans called nexum, which is debt bondage. So Romans could be enslaved for defaulting on a debt. And this was perceived as the lesser of 2 evils because the alternative punishment was death. The slaves could not be kept in Roman or Latin territory, and they had to be sold, as the phrase was, abroad across the Tiber. However, there was a third possibility besides being free and being a slave, and that was debt bondage. And it was distinct from being a slave. It was a contract that was entered by a poor person and their creditor, a voluntary agreement in which they would serve as a bondsman for the creditor, but they had certain rights. They retained their status as Roman citizens, and they continued to live in Rome. They could not be sold away from Rome. So we can look at some.
And they were for a period of time, right? They were not forever.
They had the ability to buy their way out at a certain point, yes. But frequently it was forever. So we can look at some of the historical implications that historians take away from the 12 tables. The first of them is that the legislation concerning slave status indicates that slavery was well established in Rome in the 5th century. Probably Cornell believes, and scholars believe, that the slave proportion was not really significant. And primarily these would have been people who were captured in raids or the offspring of slaves, usually the natural children of Roman citizens, and to some extent defaulted debtors. The second thing that really comes out, and this was the question about the role of women. The Romans had a unique institution called the paterfamilias, the father of the family, the head of the family. And it's striking how much of the 12 tables are about the family unit. The paterfamilias exercised a virtually unrestrained authority over all persons and property within his household, including sons who were mature adults with children of their own. The paterfamilias had the right to kill members of his family or to sell them as slaves. In practice, however, that was subject to moral constraints and the limits of what was regarded as acceptable. So this is a unique feature of Roman society. And essentially the power that was exercised by these patrons was an extension of their role as the paterfamilias. The 12 tables also give you a view into the economic society of Rome. There are laws the laws containing ownership and damage to property are entirely 100% concerned with farmland, cereal crops, vines, fruit trees, and livestock. There is nothing in the 12 tables at all dealing with commercial transactions. It's as if that concept doesn't exist. There's no mention of commercial credit, industrial production, no mention of investment. And the 12 tables mention the client status. The client patron relationship. And the law declares that a patron who mistreats his client is to be accursed. But notably missing are any legal consequences for patrons who abuse their clients. So they gave lip service to some protection and limitation of the patrons, but not really. Then there was an 11th table, which was related to the closing of the Patriciate, and that prohibited intermarriage between patricians and plebeians. But this created huge backlash, and it was annulled 4 years later. And this tells us that there were some moderate patricians who did not go along, that there were factions within the patrician class, basically between hardliners and moderates. And this is one of the fault lines. There were some moderate patricians who wanted to in some way accommodate to the plebeians. So back to the decemvirate. The second decemvirate, when it was selected, it started behaving tyrannically. And now we're going back to Livy. And it refused to stand down at the end of their term. They said that we're there forever. They provoked a crisis. And the story in Livy, it's a very dramatic literary story. It used to be very well known, and there were novels written, historical novels based on it. So there's the story of what's called the attempted rape of Virginia by Appius Claudius, the leader of the decemvirs. Claudius was the only person who held office in both the first and the second decemvirate. His action prompted a new secession of the plebs and brought the crisis to a head. The decemvirs were overthrown. Appius Claudius committed suicide, and the old constitution was restored. The settlement that followed was framed in a series of laws proposed by the consuls of 449, who were L. Valerius Podius and M. Horatius Barbatus. So from their names, they're called the Valero-Horatian laws, right? Valero-Horatian laws of 449. And this was a huge victory for the plebeians. The first law recognized the fact that the tribunes were sacrosanct. That's a huge deal. The effort was to give statutory recognition to the tribunes and the plebeian organization, and as such, it was a great victory. Thereafter, they became an established part of the political system, even though there was still tension and there was still conflict, but they were no longer completely outsiders. There is now a degree of integration. The second law concerned citizen rights of appeal, and the appeal had been established earlier, but it seems that this second Horatio law, Valero-Horatian law, basically protected the right of appeal to make sure that it was not reversed. And the third law was said by the sources to make plebiscites valid on the entire people, but it's clear that there was a later law that did the same thing. So it seems pretty clear that there were limits, there were conditions on plebiscites being valid for the whole people, and they probably gave the patricians some ability to resist and maybe not outright veto, but they had the ability to basically come in and say, well, there had been a religious violation, and strike a law down because they got a bad omen. They saw the birds flying in a way that they said was a bad omen, or the liver of the sheep that they sacrificed was malformed. And then they would say, okay, you can't have your law because it's now invalid. That's the way religion affected politics in Rome. Or perhaps the plebeian, the plebiscites had to be approved by another assembly. Now, a number of the innovations of the plebeians were now incorporated into the Roman state. The tribal assembly, based on the tribes created by Servius Tullius, was created, and it had no centuriate structure at all. This was a new assembly, the tribal assembly, and it was an imitation of the plebeian tribal assembly, but this was an assembly of the whole Roman people. And this was to become the major place where laws were passed in the Roman assembly, in the Roman Republic, in the tribal assembly, created, as I said, inspired by the plebeian assembly. The office of quaestor was also created, and that was an imitation of the aediles. The quaestors were assisted to assist the consuls in their work. They became military officials when the consuls were leading the army. Later, they would have tax collecting duties and things like that. And then they also created what were called curule aediles. So the word curule, Curule, means it's an official position of the entire Roman state, right? So, and the aediles, so basically what this did was it gave non-plebeians the opportunity to be an aedile, and this became important as a way to get your name known among the electorate, because the aediles had various responsibilities for taking care of the streets and the market. And in the later republic, the aediles would put on big games and public festivals and public feasts as a way to ingratiate themselves with the voters and get their names known, just like we have politicians now going to Iowa and eating corn dogs. That was the aediles.
Well, how spread was literacy then? I mean,
there have been studies of this, and it's really, and so the estimate is that less than 10% of the population was literate. We know that in the later republic, the army became a vehicle for spreading literacy because there were written orders. But at this stage, we must imagine that even many of the well-to-do couldn't read. Okay, so during this whole period, and continuing for the next 50 years, they're presented as a periods of political tension and strife that led ultimately to far-reaching social and political changes. The major underlying issues were land, debt, and the political right of the plebeians. So, the power of the ruling class was based on, to a large part, on the unequal distribution of what was called the public land, the ager publicus. The ager publicus was land that was seized by the Romans in war. And this land was not just divvied up, it was maintained as the property of the state. And then individual citizens were then permitted to use this land. Now, the land holdings of the small farmers, the small peasants, were tiny. We read about Romulus giving his supporters 5 inguera of land. 5 inguera of land is not enough to feed a family. You will starve to death on 5 inguera of land. So the point is that the poor peasants depended on farming the ager publicus for their survival. They had to do it. And the problem was that the majority of the public land was controlled and permanently occupied by the wealthiest families and their clients. So this was really this was a starvation issue for the plebeians. So we should note that during the entire time that there was plebeian political agitation around land, they never asked for the redistribution of land that was held privately. They were exclusively concerned with the public land. So the plebeians demanded that newly conquered land should be distributed in allotments that would become the private property of the individual recipients. And the idea there was that if the land was the private property of the recipients, then the rich people couldn't encroach on it and kick them off it. And additionally, they demanded a statutory limit on the amount of public land that any one paterfamilias could occupy, and then also a limit on the amount of livestock that they could put on this land. And this was really exacerbated greatly by the Roman conquest of the city of Veii in 394 BC. Now, this was a huge event in the history of Rome. Veii was a Etruscan city close to Rome, 18 kilometers north of Rome, northwest of Rome. Previous to this, Roman warfare had been exclusively fighting against raids of mountain people who would come down into the lowlands during the summer and loot and raid, grab crops, grab slaves, grab whatever they could grab, and then leave. And this worked very nicely with the Roman military system, where, you know, they would have summer soldiers, and their main business was to defend the Republic against these incursions and these raids. But the war with Veii was a whole other thing, because Veii was like Rome. Veii was a settled, civilized city-state with a large population and a large amount of land. The war went on for many years. There was a lengthy siege, even though some of the details are believed to be literary elaborations. For example, they say that the siege of Veii lasted 10 years, and the professors say that that's too much like the Trojan War, you know, that's a literary invention. But the real point is that the conquest of Veii happened, and that massively increased the availability of public land by about 50%. So this really made this question of dealing with the public land really, really vital and pressing. And then totally related to this was the question of debt. Now, I talked before about debt bondage. So debt bondage was a direct consequence. Well, debt was a direct consequence of poverty and land hunger, not having enough land, unequal distribution of the public land. As a result, many plebeians were forced to basically agree to become debt bondsmen, nexum as they called it. And the thing to understand is that the most important function of debt bondage was to provide a dependent labor force for exploitation by large landowners. Thus, we can see that the issues of public land and debt bondage are directly related. The situation was aggravated by the sack of Rome by the Gauls in 397 BC. The Gallic army lived off the land for several months, and this would have caused the poor peasants to lose everything. They're faced with starvation, and they had no choice but to go into debt and ultimately into debt bondage. So this was the subject of tremendous agitation until it came to a head into what were called the laws of Licinius and Sextius, also called rogations. Right? It's just basically just another word for an accepted proposal. So the Licinio or Licinio would be the correct pronunciation. Sextian rogations of 367. And this was a transformation, once again, of the social and economic structure of Rome. And it saw the beginning of the emergence of a brand new social class that I'm going to talk about. So the Licinio-Sextian laws had some kind of modest economic measures. And they were kind of sops that were thrown to the plebeians. They didn't last very long. But the the institutional results were really important. The first of them, well, the Romans had, and I don't want to get into this because it's in the long run, it didn't mean all that much, and it's there's very little data on it, so we really don't know much about it. But for the last 50 years before this, there have been frequently years, actually the majority of years, where the Romans had not elected consuls. And instead, they had elected something that they called tribunes with consular power, which basically just meant more consuls, maybe 4, maybe sometimes 6, who shared the consular power. And some people say that the reason that they did this was to give a way for plebeians to participate without going to the extent of allowing plebeians to become consul. So this was the huge result of these reforms, was that the consulship was opened to plebeians, and this changed everything in Rome. So the next decade, so this radically changed plebeian rights in relationship to the state and in relationship to the magistracies. The next decade saw plebeian consuls conducting military campaigns. They saw a plebeian dictator and a plebeian censor. So here's the key. The enactment of the laws were a victory for the leading plebeians, but not the rank and file. Many of the leading plebeians were wealthy, socially aspiring, and politically ambitious, as I said. Such men had preferred to join the organized plebeian movement, which offered the possibility of independent power. Their only alternative would have been to attach themselves to a patrician patron and abandon any pretense of independence. So this changed all that. They now had access to the consulship. However, only a small group of rich and aspiring plebeians derived any advantage from this. These ambitious men had made common cause with the poor, and then had used the institutions of the plebeian movement to gain entry into the ranks of the ruling class. The poor gained some economic relief, but lost control of their organization. And immediately, once the plebeian leaders were admitted into the ruling class on an equal footing with the patricians, they immediately acquired all the characteristics of the ruling class, turned their back on their former constituents, and ceased to represent the interests of the plebes.
So, I mean, it was very, very efficient because they divide to conquer and then they
That's
vote.
right. And this is what the Romans did. They co-opted the opposition.
Right.
And
Instead of fighting, they
and it
divide
worked.
them.
It worked really,
Yeah.
really well. This is really, if you want to just boil it down to a nutshell, this is the reason for the success of the Roman Empire. Right?
So, I'm
The
sorry.
Romans had the ability, to incorporate the leading elements of conquered people, give them some role to play, some type of political power, and then make them the enforcers of Roman rule over their population. Yeah, there was a question. Sorry.
Yeah, it's really just a comment on what we, I guess, see in today's society, that there's a group of people who will never understand that if everybody has some piece of the pie, it makes for a much better society than if there is, and here we see it in ancient Rome, a continual underclass of people who are missing out on the necessities to make their lives better, not to become rich, but to sustain their families, and but food and shelter, and all the way on up to present day, of course, education and so on and so on. So in my view, this stratus of people hasn't been able to form the perfect society.
Well, we know that, I think the best thing to say is, perfection is an ideal, which is to say that it's never achieved, right?
True.
perfection is something that you may strive for either in reality or just in terms of rhetoric because it sells, because it makes you popular, but you're never going to achieve perfection. And there has always been an underclass in every society, including Soviet society.
Yeah.
Um, but what the Romans were geniuses about was co-optation, and that
Right.
is happening in our society as well. And we're going to see. Let me just we'll hold this thought for a minute, but there is something is going to happen to the plebeians as a whole, which is once again analogous to this co-option. Basically, to use a coarse expression, shit flows downhill, and we're going to see that there's always somebody lower down that can be the person that's going to have to absorb the bad news. So
Thank you.
So basically, once the plebeians were admitted to the ruling class, the plebeian movement lost its revolutionary identity and ceased to exist as a state within the state, right? That's really critical. It's no longer a revolutionary organization. I mean, this notion of a state within the state, sometimes called dual power, if you read the theorists of the Russian Revolution, in particular Trotsky, he talks particularly about dual power, the difference between the provisional government and the Soviets as being the key to the dynamics of revolution. And that's what now stopped in Rome. The institutions of government were incorporated into the normal machinery of government. The institutions of the plebes were incorporated into the normal machinery of government and became a convenient mechanism. They were now part of the ruling class. Instead of legislating in the interest of the plebes, the plebeian institutions became a convenient mechanism for legislation promoted by the nobility. So this was an earth-shaking change in the Republic. And this is the birth, of a new social class. The old aristocracy of birth had now been transformed by the introduction of plebeians into the ranks of consuls, the highest office of the state. So now we had something new. It was still an oligarchy, but it was a competitive oligarchy based on a mixture of personal distinction. In other words, did you rise to become consul? If you became consul, your family was basically ennobled forever. So you would join this oligarchy either through your own personal distinction, becoming consul, and Rome then had this idea of what they called new men, which were people who achieved the consulate without having illustrious ancestors. And some of the most well-known would be Gaius Marius, who reformed the Roman army and was consul 7 times, and the famous Cicero was a new man. And they were always people of extraordinary capabilities, as both Marius and Cicero were, and they had to be in the right place at the right time, but they could achieve this distinction. And then their ancestors were then considered nobility. And this was a new social class. It was no longer there was still a recognition of that the patricians had more status, but the plebeians were equal in every way that mattered, and they would intermarry with the patricians. Particularly, sometimes the patricians would become impoverished. So it would be a good way. The plebeians the plebeian rich, the plebeian nobles, and they called themselves, by the way, the nobilitas. That was their name for themselves. They could basically elevate their prestige and status by marrying their children to the children of the patricians. And what the patricians would gain would be a huge infusion of cash and resources that would basically enable them to maintain the existence of their line, of their family. When they may have been threatened with being removed from the Senate because they didn't have enough wealth to qualify for the census, right? The census would, among other things, would see whether people who were in the Senate had enough wealth to stay in the Senate. And if they didn't, they were booted out of the Senate. So this was a huge, huge change. And from now on, it's not, you don't really want to talk about the patricians. You want to talk about the nobility. And in functional terms, there's no difference between the patricians and the noble plebeian houses. They're the same thing. They're part of the same establishment. They're jointly the ruling class of Rome. And to get back to this other question about, the poor in society, we have some this period after in this whole time saw a massive growing importance of slavery in Rome. And the ironic thing is that this was an unintended consequence of the measures to relieve the condition of debt bondage. So we said that debt bondage was the source of a dominated agricultural workforce to work the land for the rich landowners. If once they start to eliminate debt bondage, where are they going to get poor people to work their land for almost nothing? And the answer is slavery. And we see a massive increase. This is where Rome starts to become a slave society. We're talking in the time, in the time of the second half of the 4th century. And we see in 357, we know that there was a tax on manumissions. Manumission is when you free slaves. So there wouldn't be a tax on manumissions unless there were a lot of manumissions. And there wouldn't be manumissions unless there were a lot of slaves, yes.
Paul, I'm sorry, but what happened to the poor? I mean, they have a competition now, someone that, the illegals,
they were able to get some of them a bigger piece of the agripublicus. But let me show you this part. This is also, let me see. Oh. Okay, so in 343, we have the beginning of what was called the First Samnite War, and this was in the sources. The sources say that this was the first time that the Romans started mass enslavement of prisoners. And so here's the answer to my answer to your question, Marika, is that the Roman citizens who were no longer on the land were free to become soldiers. And Romans started to pay their soldiers. And so you had this process where many of what had been the Roman plebes were now profiting from Rome's imperialism. Right? There was as I said, Rome was a genius at co-opting people. And they let enough trickle down so that their plebeians would join the army. The army would now become a more effective method for conquering their neighbors, and they would get more land and they'd get more loot. And this became a self-reinforcing cyclical process. That's where the free people went. And that's what the slaves were doing. And then, of course,
if you were poor,
some other part of the free people who weren't able to profit from this would become landless proletariat, the lowest of the low.
So what were your options if you were poor? You don't have land. You are not needed as a free labor because someone else is freer than, cheaper than you. So you will join the army and they will pay you a salary and you survive.
You'd have an ability to join the army, and you would then participate in the loot, in the booty that was obtained. It wasn't really the salary that you got; it was your ability to participate in the loot.
Right.
And the Romans had a very organized way of distributing loot. It wasn't just a question of you just run in and the soldiers would run into the farmhouse and take the pigs. And, you see this in movies of German soldiers in Russia, chasing pigs, as they're the Nazis are moving east. It wasn't like that. What the Romans did, and this is clearly documented in Polybius, the Romans would collect all the booty in a central location, and there were guards and capital punishment for any soldier who cheated. And then they would, in an organized way, they would distribute the booty to the army. And you had a reason, depending on where you were serving, you had a reasonable chance of, if not becoming rich, at least becoming independent. So that's why later on you see that some, depending on where the war was going to be, some wars were more popular than others. So if you had a war in Greece or in Asia Minor, that was where you wanted to be, because those places were hugely rich. You knew you had it made. But if they were going to send you to Spain, where nobody had anything, all you could do was die and lose your land back home because your wife couldn't run the farm without you. So it was, life was tough. But the whole genius of the Romans was that they provided. I mean, this was not open to everybody. This was open to ambitious, striving people. It was a competitive society, and you had to be tough to survive. And if you were, there were some opportunities for you, and you were ruthless. You weren't a nice guy, right? But there was some wealth to go around. And that created a buy-in, right? A buy-in to the Roman society by the Roman people. They profited from Roman imperialism on a large scale. So in this period, after the Licinius-Sextian laws, it becomes appropriate for the first time to refer to all non-patricians as plebeians, because the plebeian no longer had the sense of being the revolutionary plebeian organization. Now all it meant was that you weren't a patrician, and that really wasn't the important distinction now. The important distinction was the nobilitas, who consolidated their domination of the state, and from now on, membership in the nobilitas, not patrician descent, was the defining social boundary between the political elite and the rest of the population. The office of the tribune of the plebes was not abolished, but instead it became a stepping stone for aspiring young nobles and was used as an instrument of policy by the nobility. So, for example, if there was a rambunctious tribune who tried to be a rabble-rouser, there was always another tribune who was a member of the plebeian nobility who would veto that tribune on behalf of the nobles. So the tribunate, rather than being a revolutionary force, now became a reactionary force, part of the control, the social control, to prevent legal measures that would threaten the dominance of the ruling class.
Paul, may I ask how the plebeians, the tribunes were elected, or
they were still elected in the tribune in the plebeian assembly, the plebeian tribal assembly. Any citizen who was a plebeian could vote in the tribal assembly, and every year they would elect tribunes.
Okay, it's for a year, right?
Yeah. So all of the Roman, the only Roman position that was more than a year was the censor. Censor lasted for 5 years because the census happened every 5 years. Mm-hmm. But every other Roman office and the priesthoods were for life. Okay. But the elected magistracies were all 1 year.
Okay, thanks.
And I want to focus on this question of creating this really competitive society. Okay. So as the tribunate becomes transformed to a tool of the ruling class, Livy describes some of the tribunes as, quote, slaves of the nobles. And during this period, many of the plebeian measures that were introduced in the plebeian assembly through plebiscites actually favored the new oligarchic nobility, the nobilitas, and were often concerned to extend the principle of power sharing between plebeians and patricians. And the final nail in the coffin, if you will, and this was the end point for the my timeline is the Lex Hortensius, a law of named after the consul of 287, and really the point here is that it removed the last vestige of obstruction by patrician hardliners, while at the same time keeping the legislative process firmly in the hands of the nobles. So they could now allow plebiscites to have the force of law, even though plebiscites were only voted on by plebeians. They could have the force of law for the whole people because they had tamed tribunes, right? They had tribunes that were essentially arms of the Senate that would keep things in order. And this is really the way things went until the famous tribunate of the Gracchi, of Tiberius Gracchus and his younger brother in the 2nd century. And we're going to deal with that later, so I'm going to talk about it now. But to say that Tiberius and his brother Gaius Gracchus are seen as the John and Bobby Kennedy of Rome. But the whole point was that the other tribunes were there to make sure that they couldn't get away with anything. No nonsense. And at the same time, so this was now the nature of the Roman state going forward. And now we can start talking about the constitution that Polybius described. Everything up until here, what I've tried to give you has been the evolution of these offices, where they came from, what sort of struggles, what sort of negotiations, what sort of compromises. And you could collectively say that this represents Roman political genius, right? These were nasty, they were not nice people, but there was a negotiation that went on. And they came up with something that was sustainable and which lasted for 1,000 years and was the biggest empire known in the West up until that time. So,
but I'm sure that there were people who were not agreeing with all this, but they will not count, and they were not counted.
well,
I mean, historians or on the records.
Very few. Well, actually, that's very interesting. I mean, understand that these historians were aristocrats who had the leisure to write history, right?
They would write the history that will sell too.
Yeah, well, but that too, they would write history. Like, for example, Livy seemed to be very interested in entertainment, and his history was very popular and very poetic, and he was obviously writing to be read by his peers. He was an associate. He was in Augustus's inner circle. He was a close friend, comrade of Augustus Caesar, and all of his ancient historians were senators. So that's where they came from. That's what they wrote about. And in the ancient world, there's a huge distrust of democracy. It's not until after the establishment of the Roman Empire that you start to read sympathetic depictions of democracy. But all the historians before that thought of democracy as mob rule. And Thucydides gives you example after example of the Athenian assembly making really stupid decisions and murderous decisions because they were swayed by demagogues. And that also part of Polybius's political theory, his analysis of governments, is that democracy is a degenerate form of mob rule. And it's not until quite a bit later that the word democracy starts to get a positive connotation. Yeah.
I just wanted to add that we know that Socrates and Plato hated democracy, thought the same thing. That it's much better for the enlightened, monarch to rule rather than democracy. It's a rule of the mob. Yeah.
Right, and Socrates was tried and executed by the democratic faction in Athens because he was considered to be anti-democratic and pro-Spartan.
But we don't really know what Socrates thought. We know what Plato claims he thought, right?
Well, we do know what he was convicted of, and we do
Yeah.
what he was accused of, and we have independent. We have we're not just relying on Plato. We also have Xenophon.
Okay.
He also wrote Apologia. Yeah.
So,
But still, the people writing all these citrus were upper class types who hate democracy anyway.
well, no, the people who ran this were demagogues. You know, they were.
Yeah.
Think of Donald Trump, if you will, right?
Yeah.
Think of somebody
No,
who cares about nothing but himself, but finds a way to manipulate people's anger and their emotions in order to achieve power for himself.
Mhm.
Classical definition of a tyrant, if you will.
Yeah.
So here we have, you know, a modern depiction, probably of some movie of the Roman Senate, and they're now. This is the nobilitas. So the last solid piece of information I want to give is to really describe the nature of what really made them tick. And that is something that was called the Cursus. It's an extra U, I'm sorry about that. Honorum, the path of honor. And these, what I'm showing you here are a sequence of offices. The dotted line is to say that everything above that confers membership in the Senate. So if you achieve the office of quaestor, automatically that made you a member of the Senate. Young noblemen, once again, the Roman society was tremendously tilted towards the military. And you had to serve really 20 years in the military ultimately to really say that you did your duty, that you, just in order to have a public life. And so the earliest office that many of these people would have would be military tribune, which was essentially like equivalent to the rank of colonel in modern army. And there would be 6 of them per legion, and typically they would be either the sons of senators or equestrians. They're the upper class, and this was their first step up the ladder. And they would get their position frequently through nepotism, right? They would have a family connection, or their father would be an amacitia with a consul or with a higher officer. So this is where all of the stuff that I've talked about, all of this comes into play. And you get yourself to be military tribune. Then the first really important office was the quaestor, of which there were, all of these things had, you know, the numbers of them were increased over the years. And I think the highest that the quaestor reached was 20. They were, among other things, they were tax collectors, and they basically would handle the finances of the legion, right? So the consul who was leading the legion would have a quaestor who would act as his paymaster and act as the person that would guard the money that had been allocated by the Senate for him to pay his soldiers, and would have to present his accounts to the Senate after a campaign was over. Then the praetor was an intermediate office, and they were primarily judicial officials. They basically took the judicial responsibility off the shoulders of the consuls. They ran the law courts. They supervised lawsuits. And it was the step up the ladder. And then finally you'd have consul. Now, there were other offices as well. I mean, I talked about aedile, I talked about censor, but this is the key. These 3 offices, quaestor, praetor, consul, is this path of honor. And if you look at it, you see, look at the numbers. The numbers of offices, it's a pyramid. It really is. As the years go on, there are fewer and fewer of these offices, and you never go backwards, you know, just like you never see a president going and running for senator or a senator running for congressman. You have to go up, and your prestige depended on this. If you reached, in order to be part of the in-group, If you wanted to have respect, you had to have been consul. There's no other way to do it. So this meant that even though you had this oligarchy, this wasn't an oligarchy, it wasn't a lazy oligarchy. They didn't just sit back and say, okay, let's exploit the people and be fat, dumb, and happy and have a lot of orgies and banquets. They were involved in this intense and often bloody competition among themselves for this smaller number of higher offices. At the same time, if you think about it, consul was elected every year. So if you assume that that most US presidents get 2 terms, in 8 years in the United States, you have one man who has the chief office. In Rome, in the same period, you had 16 men. So the idea of actually achieving it, and the polity was much smaller, and the even smaller was the number of people who even had a possibility of making it to the top. So you really had a shot at it. It wasn't like, every little kid in the kindergarten, Johnny, what do you want to be? Or Susie, I want to be president of the United States. Ha, ha, ha. Here, little Gaius, what do you want to be? You want to be consul? Well, that was a real possibility. Not only was it a real possibility, but your life was considered a failure if you didn't achieve that. In some way, you had not measured up to your ancestors. You were disgraced. So there was a huge competition. That was the nature of the Roman aristocracy. And that's one of the reasons that Rome was hungry all the time. It was because the way that you would get higher up was to become known. And typically the way that you become known was succeeding in war, being a good military leader. And you can see how this, and the ultimate honor was a triumph, which was a ceremony that was awarded usually to a consul and sometimes to dictators, and very infrequently, but happening to praetors as well, where you'd have this huge parade through the city. You see this in all the movies. This was the only time that you were allowed to bring armed troops into Rome, was to walk in your triumphal parade. And this was the objective of every Roman aristocrat. And their Roman aristocrats are remembered by how many times they were consul and how many times they celebrated a triumph. So
we have a question here,
yeah.
If it's okay.
Yeah, no, sure. I'm kind of at the end now, so please, let's have discussion and questions now.
Sure. So what did we know of a slave and class revolts?
Of what? Of a slave?
Or class revolts?
Oh, quite a bit. So the first recorded large-scale slave revolt was in Sicily in about, I think, 120 BC. And this was huge. It was much bigger than the Spartacus Revolt. And basically, what would happen is that, the slaves revolted en masse on Sicily. Sicily was basically one of the major sources of grain for Rome. And so it was huge landed estates worked by slaves in miserable conditions. And they had, totally arbitrary, basically, Cato wrote a book on how to run your household, in which he basically talks about squeezing the last drop of work out of a slave until he either dies or you sell him, because why should you pay for a slave in his old age? He's not doing any good for you at all. So this was a science for the Romans. How do you wring everything out of a slave? And the conditions of life were miserable. And then they had this revolt in about 120 BC, and it lasted for about 10 years. And there were all sorts of massacres of Roman citizens. And finally, they'd send a small army, and the small army would get massacred. And they send a bigger army, and the bigger army would get massacred. And finally, they'd take it seriously, and they'd send a consular army with multiple legions, and they'd kill all the leaders of the slaves. They'd crucify thousands of people, and that would be the end of the slave revolt. Then the Spartacus Revolt, which was, I think, in the 70s BC, it's basically the same thing. We say that Spartacus, famously was a gladiator who were slaves, but the body of people who took part in Spartacus Rebellion were agricultural slaves who fled and said, okay, we have nothing to lose. And it was the exact same idea. You know, the Spartacus destroyed a small army, he destroyed a praetor army, and then finally the combination of Marcus Licinius Crassus and Pompey the Great brought armies in to finally, you know, wipe up Spartacus and remove him forever. You know, and as we know, Spartacus is a legendary figure in the world, you know, socialist communist movement. The first communist party of Germany was called the Spartacus League.
Paul, I have a question about how did the office of Tribune develop into military?
Could you speak a little louder, Greg? I'm having difficulty hearing you.
How is office of Tribune developed into the military Tribune? And what are the numbers? How many tribunes were there? Was there any limit in numbers? And how this happened that they became military tribune? If it's 6 per legion, it seems to be a lot of them.
Yeah. So here's the point. There's no relationship between military tribunes and tribunes of the plebes.
Okay.
They were totally separate. And Rome is confusing because they have so many things that have the same names, right? But in this particular case, the tribunes of the plebes, those officers, had no relation at all to the military tribunes. If anything, the military tribunes were related to, as I talked about, the tribunes with consular authority that were elected instead of consuls in the second half of the 5th century. So these were purely military officers. They always had been.
Is there a number of tribunes of plebs, by the way?
Is there a number of
the tribunes of plebs? I mean,
10.
What were the is the maximum number?
10.
10.
Okay,
and the military
originally, I think, you know, the oldest records, they say they were 2, and then there were 4, but ultimately there were 10.
Yeah, and military tribunes, did they have any? Because you know, maybe at some point we'll talk more about the Roman army, but did they have? Did they command like a cohort or
yes,
something?
Exactly.
Like that? There would be a cohort.
They would command 2 cohorts, right? Because there were 10 cohorts in a legion, and so essentially a tribune would command 2 cohorts, and then you'd have one senior tribune who had some authority in the army as a whole.
And the legats. Oh, I don't know if I.
What's that?
Legats is the leader of the legion, the general.
The legats.
Greg, you're very soft. If you can talk a little bit louder,
Yeah,
it's hard to hear.
You know, something. I have to check my something wrong with my speaker with the microphone. Okay, but explain about the legats. How they
legats were they're post-republic. Legats are I think are an imperial office, and they certainly did not exist in the early republic.
Oh, okay.
Right. I mean, as time goes on, as Rome's military commitments expand, they didn't have enough officers. If they just, first of all, they only had 2 consuls, so they had to start coming up with other officers who would lead the legions. And then it became very tricky because, you know, during the empire, if you had command of a number of legions, you could become the next emperor. So they would try to get people who were not leading senators, and that's, I think, where the legats come in.
What time do you think approximately?
We're talking about 1st century AD.
On the legats?
Yeah.
Only at that time?
After, I think in the empire.
Not at the time of Caesar or Gaius?
I don't believe so, but I mean, I could be wrong about that, but I don't think that's the case. I mean, you read about legates, I believe, were one of the offices created by Augustus, who wanted to make sure that he could avoid the situation where people might try to overthrow him. So the legate was somebody that was not a senator, didn't have independent, political ambitions in his own right, and they could be trusted more easily.
But tribunes, military tribunes, should have been of senatorial rank, I would imagine.
That's right, exactly. So a tribune was somebody on the make, right? Tribune was somebody who wanted to have a political career. There's no doubt about the fact that Gaius Marius started as a military tribune.
Paul, when did you say that the army, the soldiers start getting paid?
It looks like it was in 405 BC.
Okay, because I think that was very important, because the power of the commanders start losing power, because before, right?
Not much, not really, because you still only had command of the army for a year, and Rome was expanding. The army was still not a standing army. It wasn't a professional army. It just meant that they were being paid while they were on service.
Right, but before they
have
but
they're still an army of farmers.
Right, but before they have more loyalty to your commander, because you want to go and get
command. It's really a question of what loyalty does the commander have to you. What does the commander do?
He can get better wars and get better
so what I'm saying is
booty and better.
What I'm saying is that the place where that really starts in large scale is Gaius Marius. And we're talking really about the end of the 2nd century BC, 110 BC, 105 BC. And that's the point at which Marius takes responsibility for finding land for his legionaries after the army is disbanded, right? Before that, it was the Senate's responsibility. So you were in the army's disbanded. It was up to the Senate to find some, reward for you in the rest of your life. But the politics got so bitter and so just like it is now with Gaius Marius, that the Senate wouldn't cooperate with him at all. And so he took it into his own hands. And that's the point. Marius is the first guy where the legions were his legions and not the Roman legions. Okay?
Got it.
More questions, discussion. I got 2 more slides, but just
this was great, Paul. I mean, very, very, visually also is very wonderful. Great.
Thank you. Well, let me go to my last slides then. This is me on a trip to Rome, and there are some guys that hang around the Roman Forum dressed as Roman soldiers and consuls, and so right now the guy wearing a toga is taking the picture.
Paul, what position?
You don't have the uniform.
Oh, I was just walking by and they put the helmet on me and said, "You want to take a picture?" So here's my point: is that you really can't.
Were you a quester or tribune?
Well, hold on. You can't really trust the Romans, and here's why. I was not expecting this.
And you, Brutus.
Yeah, there was nobody in the world more surprised than me at this moment. So, the Romans always had a sense of humor, and it was always a kind of a brutal sense of humor.
Yeah.
And so, thank you very much. And finis, the end in Latin.
Okay. That was perfect, because I'm sure that gladiators did those things.
Yeah.
Paul, terrific. Thank you very much.
It was wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
Paul, really, really great. Thank you.
Yeah, with a lot of structure into understanding of the society.
Yeah, I think the timeline was really helpful.
Yeah.
To see how much, because you hear these dates, 450 BC, 350 BC, what's it mean? But when you see graphically the amount of time that's, that is transpiring, it gives you a different feeling for the rhythm of events and how long things take.
It helps a lot. And also, I think there were change of names, but the power was more or less the same. You know, they call Tribune, they call Plebeian, they call this, but at the end of the day, they, you know, was the same thing
Well,
with a different name.
and I think we can say that that has been true of the human race ever
Today.
since they advanced beyond hunter-gatherer groups.
Absolutely.
As soon as you become settled, and especially, you know, there's any specialization at all, the society is going to be ruled by a small number of people. And even in something like Athens, where you had a popular democracy and a real assembly, even then there was a smaller group, the boulos, that set the agenda for the assembly and so forth. And it was clear that the major political figures, the demagogues, Pericles and Cleon, Nicias, these were the real rulers of Athens. So
That's the inherent feature of any society.
yes,
Either human or animal as well.
it's basically you know, it kind of goes with the idea of organization.
Right, absolutely, yeah.
And that's why we're here as human beings, you know, because we could band together and, you know, and make it possible for our wives to have children.
And actually, it's interesting to see that so little mention of women, you know, I mean, half of the population is women or were women, and they didn't show up at all.
Where they do show up is they're usually victims of rape who commit suicide.
Right.
Well, the
and
women's,
they-
well, I think the Romans were history's ultimate real men. I'm reading up. Whoa. It's saying real man trigger that. I'm reading up on King Pyrrhus, and I'm looking at the opposite of your concept of a constitution. If Alexander the Great, if somebody tough like Alexander the Great or Pyrrhus was in charge, things were fairly stable. If somebody wasn't that tough, they got murdered immediately, and everybody else who jumped in got murdered promptly. Several women wound up in charge, and they were promptly murdered, unless they murdered the other guy first. But they got murdered in the end anyway. It was amazing how politically unstable they were.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, you know, Alexander's famous statement on his deathbed, you know, they said, well, who will be your successor? And he said, the strongest.
Well, I think Pyrrhus did something similar. I'm doing a presentation on that. That might be my starting quote.
Oh, wow.
Okay. It's a good place to start.
we
Really.
know now.
Hey, Paul?
Yeah.
A question, if you don't mind. I had to step away, so if you talked about this before, I apologize. I was wondering if you could speak to this, to Rome, the relations between the plebeians and the not the patrons. What did you call the higher class?
The patricians.
Patricians. How that was perceived by the American founding fathers, and how that got plugged into how they created the American Republic that they created at that time.
They tried to avoid it.
Can you flesh that out?
The question. So the founding fathers of the American Republic, they looked at Polybius, and Polybius was the guy who described what he called the balanced system of government. Polybius believed in the cycle of government where you'd have a type of rulership that would be initially good, and then it would degenerate, and then it would be replaced by something else that was initially good, and then it would regenerate, and it was a big cycle. So you'd have a king that was good, and he'd be replaced by a tyrant that was bad. Then he'd be replaced by an aristocracy that was good, that would turn into an oligarchy, and that was bad. And then they get replaced by some sort of popular movement. I don't remember what name he used. And then that would get replaced by democracy, the mob, and then it would go back again in a circle. And Polybius said that the genius of the Romans was that they came up with a system that combined all three elements, so that the Roman system was stable and nobody else's was. So Polybius would point to the consuls as being like the king. He pointed to the Senate as being like the aristocracy, and he pointed at the assemblies as being the democratic element. Of course, what Polybius totally ignored was that the assemblies were fixed, that the fix was in, that the rich totally outvoted the poor in the assemblies, and that it was not democratic at all. So what I'm saying is that the founding fathers liked this idea that Polybius had and the other thing that the Romans had was the idea of checks and balances. So all these things that the consul couldn't do, he only had 1 year, he could be vetoed by his colleague, and all that sort of stuff. The American founding fathers, ate that up. They loved it, but they didn't want to talk about, this question of the patriciate versus, that was revolutionary stuff. You might expect somebody like Thomas Paine to talk about that, but you weren't going to hear that from Madison or Hamilton.
Oh, but Polybius was talking about the time. I mean, that they were stable because they were so many years in power? Or?
No, he was saying it was stable because they had these three, that the Romans figured out a way to break the cycle, according to Polybius. So instead of having this big circle of, this thing degenerates, becomes this, it degenerates, becomes that, and then back again.
Right.
He said the Romans found a way to take all of the elements of the polity as Polybius analyzed it and combine them into one structure which everybody checked one another, and that was what created, according to Polybius, the stability of Rome.
And can you say, or can Polybius say that there was corruption, or that was like it's something that we should look forward? Like,
no, he wasn't talking about that this guy's on the take. What he was saying is that every form of government becomes corrupt. So you have a form of government that might start good, but it's going to degenerate into something that doesn't deserve to continue to exist. So you might have a good king, who protects his people and defends them, and then maybe a couple generations down the line, his grandson is a tyrant. So that's what he meant by corruption, right?
okay, so like it was
the good is corrupted by the evil. The good is always going to be corrupted and turn into evil. And therefore, so he said the Romans, their genius was they found a way to get off the trip, get off the boat.
Good boy, Domino. Good boy.
keep being corrupted.
Right. I mean,
Sorry.
but he was really, Polybius had his own agenda, not the least of which is that he was a prisoner of war. And I'll tell you a very funny story about Polybius. This is in Plutarch, in Plutarch's life of Cato. Cato was a senator during the life of Polybius and very famously witty and sarcastic. And Polybius had been a nobleman in Greece when the Romans defeated them in a minor war. And then so Polybius and maybe 50 or 100 other Greeks were taken to Rome as hostages. They lost their nobility. They were under house arrest. And Polybius was very lucky to become associated with this very rich family, powerful family. And then in the end of life, towards the end of his life, Polybius came to the Roman Senate and he petitioned them for permission to go back to Greece. And Cato said, well, who cares whether an old Greek dies in Rome or he dies in Greece? Let him go. But Polybius didn't have enough. Then Polybius wanted to come back again and say, well, not only do I want you to send me back to Greece, but I want you to restore my honors and my position. And then Cato said, this guy is like Odysseus going back into Cyclops' cave because he forgot his hat.
Again, Paul, amazing presentation. Thank you so much. We enjoyed it so much, and the joke at the end had sealed it for us.
You got to know, Zach, I've been saving that joke for about 5 years to the right time to spring it.
Oh, I'm glad that we created the group for this joke to be revealed, my friend. It's one of those things.
Have a wonderful time tomorrow. I'll be there. I'll be
Beverly,
here in spirit.
you're not gonna come to join us?
I can't make it either, Zach. We're entertaining,
It's
but
very far.
you can
Very,
It's
very
further for
far.
me too.
maybe you guys can throw one back for me while you're there.
Yeah.
I'm in Toronto.
Well,
I don't think I'm even allowed
Are
to
you
cross the
coming? Are you coming from Toronto?
Howard, Zach offered airfare for me, so maybe he'll offer airfare for you too.
border. I don't think I can cross the border.
Oh,
Oh yeah.
not allowed?
So maybe somebody can bring a laptop to the dinner and you can come by Zoom.
Well,
Oh,
gonna
you can
be
watch
just
us
a
eat.
table talk.
It will be delicious.
I can't even record it. Robin doesn't like
Oh,
record it, so maybe I'll figure something out. I was thinking of bringing a camera tomorrow, take pictures, but
People don't want to see people eating.
yeah,
Take a couple of snapshots,
yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, there'd be some snapshots of the dishes and everybody in the group. That would be nice to see.
Well, I was thinking of, like I said, my idea is I wanted to create a travel group within our group. I've had several people express an opinion that they want to go to Uzbekistan. And so I'm getting the opinions right now, maybe not for this year, but going next year, summer, would be a good time. We can dedicate a couple of weeks and, logistics could be worked out and we can all go to anywhere you guys want to go.
Ooh,
I have a new Uzbekistan connection. My friend's daughter-in-law was born in Tashkent. Her family came here when she was 8. She's about 40. And her grandma raised her because her mom died. And she was visiting my friend who's now learned how to make all kinds of delicious dishes. So Luda came with 35 pounds of food from Chicago to Arizona.
Oh, wow.
I want to make one comment. I'm just looking at the chat now, and I see that that Anne, I wish she was still here, took exception to my mention of Trump, and talked about virtue signalers. You don't have to be a supporter of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party to think that Trump was a disgrace to the human race.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Amen.
Okay, you weren't doing anything remotely resemble virtue signaling to me. I'm offended by virtue signaling.
I am
You
too.
weren't doing it.
I am too, and I'm the sort of guy that I can disagree with anybody about anything, So I argue with my progressive friends from the right, and I argue with my conservative friends from the left. But I'm a militant moderate, if you could imagine a contradiction in terms like that meaning something.
You meant it ironic, right?
Militant moderate?
No, conservative friends from the left and progressive from the right.
No,
I really don't. I mean, it was. I mean,
Paul meant his position in the argument.
no, I
was conservative.
Okay.
I find problems with the extremes on both sides, so I argue with both